that everybody can hear me. Welcome to this ACG event hosted by ERM. Before we go into the details about today's webinar, let me give you a brief overview of ACG for the people who don't know us yet. There will be, my son is coming in. Nee, wegwezen. Yeah. Sorry, I was interrupted by my son who actually entered the room. So first of all, again, welcome. A bit about ACG Holland for the people who don't know that yet. I will skip through a couple of introduction slides here before I hand over to ERM. So ACG is a M&A network community. It's actually with a worldwide presence, originally from the US. But here in Europe, we have also some of the bigger chapters in Germany, Spain, Netherlands, and in the UK. So also welcome to all the ACG members in the Netherlands and outside. 75% of our members, which are 160 in the Netherlands, they do business together. And it's really at the heart of the deal-making ecosystems, if you like. So Netherlands have been founded in 2005 with 160 members, and we host normally 12 of those sessions in a year. And most of the time, these are of course face-to-face, but that's been a while since we've done that. But hopefully, things will open up soon. And we can also do the wine tasting events and also our annual growth awards soon. And overall, we have a 1,500 members database. Some of the opportunities to join our community, you can either do that individually as a corporate member or also as a sponsor. Some of the sponsors are listed here already on this deck, which you also see ERM, our host today, who will be organizing the webinar, and that's the good stuff of being one of the sponsors, that you can actually do that. You are also unmuted. You can of course enter the chat or the Q&A box to post any question, and we will be presenting in a bit, or ERM will actually do that. And there's this button where you can enlarge your screen if it's not fully visible. And of course, the session is going to be recorded. So please be aware of that, and you will also receive the slides in the recording afterwards. And let me remind you that we're working with this remote platform, so you also will be able to do some networking after the webinar. So feel free to sit on a table and chat with your fellow participants of today. Whether or not Simon can share his deck. Simon will be the speaker of today, Simon Aumonier, together with Ruud Klein as moderator from ERM. And Simon Aumonier is a principal partner at ERM and director of product services and regulatory affairs in EMEA, and has already 3 decades of experience in the environmental field and assessing the sustainability and performance across different sectors, and actually also works for companies like Pfizer, which are of course very to the point these days. So let me give the floor to Simon Aumonier and Ruud Klein, and please guys take it away. Enjoy this webinar.
Fantastic, thank you very much, Eddie. Just to check that you can see my screen, is that clear?
Yeah, let me double check. Yeah, I can see it, yes.
Fantastic, and to remind everybody that there's a screen expand icon in the top right corner if you're still only seeing it on part of your screen. Good afternoon, everybody. A real pleasure to come along and speak at the ACG meeting this afternoon about the circular economy. And I'm going to give you some introduction to circular economy sort of theory and its link to the EU taxonomy, but tried to sort of not dive too deep into the theoretical concepts and focus more on where we see risk and opportunity for M&A. and delighted to answer any questions you might have at the end in the networking session. But my colleague Ruud Klein is also one of the presenters here this afternoon, and will be picking up any questions and questions that you pose in the chat as well. So please feel free to put any points there as we go through. Okay, so this is the sort of agenda that I'm going to try in about half an hour this afternoon. A bit on an outline of circular economy, full stop, how it links to the taxonomy. I'm then going to use plastics manufacturing as an example of how technical screening criteria in the taxonomy identify what is sustainability in respect of plastics manufacturing. Of course, that's only one sector of the economy, but if I was to try to go through all of the sectors of the economy, we'd be here a very long. So I'm extrapolating from that particular sector. And again, if you've got any questions about other sectors, we can try to pick those up as well. A little bit on measuring and then opportunities, as I said. Okay,
Simon,
so
Simon,
yeah.
Lucky, can you go to full screen? Because we're now looking at your slides 2, 3, and 4 as well.
Yeah, I am in full screen myself.
Oh, you are. Okay.
Yeah, I think you might need to expand your screen to see it full screen. I don't know if anybody's got any other suggestions. I'm happy to take them, but I'm seeing full screen on my my laptop. Anyway, if you can see the screen, if you can see the slides that are coming ahead, that's great for you. Not so good for me because I can't see them. So let me continue. Why the circular economy? Well, essentially we're consuming too much. You may have heard of the Earth Overshoot Day that's been calculated. That's the day in the year where we've used up already all the resources that would be sustainable. Last year that was August the 22nd globally. In Switzerland it was May the 11th. That's roughly two planet Earths of materials and resources we're consuming every year, and that has to stop if the definition of sustainability is to be achieved. You can see on the slide resource extraction, the use of all of these rare resources is responsible for biodiversity, for water stress, for greenhouse gas emissions and human health impacts.
Simon, everyone is still looking at your very first slide.
Okay, so I will go back to...
If you have the availability on presentation mode as well, that would be great.
So let me try again.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe Simon, put full presentation mode. Maybe that.
So I'm just going into presentation mode. What do you see now, guys?
The same.
Yeah, we see the smaller slides on the left. So if you put it in full presentation mode on your own laptop, then it should. Then you should only see one slide, and if you click through it, we would be able to see that as well.
That's what I was doing.
Or select the slide on the left hand if you talk through it.
So what can you see now?
Same.
Yes, so we'll see your PowerPoint as you see it. So with one big slide, which you are presenting, and then the smaller ones on the left, the tiles. So if you can select the tiles on the left while you go through it, then we should be able to follow it.
Does that change anything?
No, because it's still red circled on the smaller tile. So if you select them on the left bar, then it should be able to flip.
So I am moving into presenter mode, the full screen, and it's not changing anything on your screen. So,
but no. Otherwise, then let's talk through it while we go on.
And again, this is comments at all?
No. Ah, there's Fiona with the ACG Holland screen. There it works.
Right, what can you see now then on the ACG screen? Do you want to? So what can the rest of the audience see?
Fiona says, Simon, stop sharing and ask me when you want to click through.
Okay, thank you very
much. Now we are at slide 1 again.
Right, so if you go through to slide 4, Fiona, that would be great, thank you.
Okay.
I can see slide 2. If you go to 4. Okay, so I was talking to this slide, talking about the overconsumption that we have as society at the moment, the fact that that has to end if we're going to address these types of environmental impact and sustainability objective. You can see on the top right side of the slide there, the McKinsey commodity price index, which is showing that from 2000 we started to see a very steep rise in commodity costs associated with the fact that efficiency in exploration and extraction had ended by that point. So we were now seeing scarcer resources, more difficult resources to extract and process, and the effect of that being rising cost and rising environmental impact as well. If you move on to the next slide, please, Fiona. So what is the circular economy? Well, in a piece of work I did a couple of years ago, we found more than 100 different definitions. This is the one in the European Commission's circular economy plan, and essentially it's saying, keep materials in use as long as possible, and recover energy as far as possible, and reduce waste production to the extent that that's achievable as well. There are various estimates of the benefit of circular economy initiatives. They vary considerably in terms of the economic benefit that they point to, but it's a very considerable sum, whether that's in Europe or globally, and it would be well worth having a slice of that, I think, in anybody's book. On the right-hand side of the screen there, you'll see a diagram that shows material flows into and out of the European economy for 2014, upon which the action plan was based, and there are very substantial quantities of materials of various types leaving the economy, and the aim essentially is to stop as much of that as possible, and to get value from it, and such that we don't waste any of the resources and energy coming into the system in the first place. Again, if you move on, please, Fiona. So you may well have seen this butterfly diagram of the circular economy produced by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, very good source of information and tools on the circular economy, and it's demonstrating the concept of moving away from linear consumption systems. Take, make, and dispose models are often referred to, and replacing them with increasingly tight circular management of materials. Energy. The diagrams distinguishes between the technical system, where mineral resources are used on the right-hand side, and the bioeconomy or biomass systems on the side. Mineral systems are de facto non-renewable. There's a finite amount of these elements on the Earth. The biological systems are renewable, but at the same time they are exhaustible. If you cut down too much forest, it's no longer sustainable. If you try to produce too much from soils, they equally can become exhausted and eroded, so that your systems are no longer sustainable. Next slide, please, Fiona. And here's a diagram that's rather more simple than the multiple flows in the butterfly diagram, but essentially showing the same thing, making it more simple. presenting it in terms of some easy to grasp principles, and the aim is to minimize inputs, to maximize the prevention of wastes, and then optimizing overall efficiencies. Essentially, circular economy resolves to getting more from less, in delivering, and I think this is quite important, functions that the economy seeks to be delivered. And I've emboldened a few of the most important parts of these principles on the left-hand side here: decoupling resource use, circular design and business models, and perhaps the bottom one as well that I'll come back to, whole system assessments during and after implementing changes. This is essentially a due diligence check, a priori and post hoc, to make sure that we are delivering the changes that we seek to through various initiatives. And again, that's closely linked to the taxonomy that I'm going to go on to talk about in a minute. Next slide, please, Fiona. I think we need to move on to here. And so financing sustainable growth, we're not going to bring about the changes we need to see in the economy that will deliver against these sustainability objectives unless there's very substantial investment. The Commission has therefore, European Commission therefore has a goal of integrating sustainability into financial decision making as smoothly as possible, thereby incentivizing private capital to flow to green projects, and hopefully that's what you're all interested in. And that way there'll be a partnership between both private and public sector investments that hopefully will be sufficient to bring about the transformations that the Commission envisages. Next slide, please, Fiona. So reporting obligations, how's it going to do this? Well, the non-financial reporting directive is requiring companies to disclose the proportion of their activities that are sustainable according to the EU taxonomy, both as a proportion of turnover and expenditures. So the Commission has introduced relatively recently, in fact, a taxonomy, a framework to help determine what activities can be considered environmentally sustainable, to ensure that that's applied consistently across the economy. The taxonomy regulation came into force in July last year, so it's relatively new, and we'll come on to its first delegated act, I think, on the slide. What we're seeing here is we've moved to the next slide already. That's fine. So just let's go on to the next slide. That's fine, Fiona. Thanks. So the taxonomy introduced last year, and determining if economic activities qualify as sustainable, and the degree, therefore, that an investment in those activities is environmentally sustainable. It's setting out 6 component parts of environmental sustainability, and those are listed down the middle of the slide: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, sustainable and protection of water and marine resources, transition to a circular economy, which is largely what I'm talking about today, pollution prevention and control, and protection and restoration of biodiversity and ecosystems. The expectation is that there'll be more objectives introduced around social and governance aspects to the taxonomy later on. Okay, next slide, please, Fiona. And move on another. So the first 2 objectives, or those environmental objectives in the taxonomy to be addressed, are climate change mitigation and adaptation. And there's a draft delegated act that demonstrates how those definitions will be applied. It's available on the Commission's website at the moment in draft, and is to be formally adopted by the end of this month. So we're sort of bang up to date in what's on the table here. The definitions are intended to be applied from the 1st of January next year. And critically, the definitions set out what constitutes a substantial contribution to these sustainability objectives, and also what could be defined as doing no significant harm. So in order to be classified as sustainable, an activity, and therefore the investment in that activity, has to provide a substantial contribution against one of those 6 environmental objectives, but at the same time it must do no significant harm to any of the other 5. So this is to avoid counterproductive initiatives gaining a benefit in one area but having a worse impact in another. So far, all we've seen published is the draft definitions for climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. Not yet for the circular economy, but I'm going to talk about what these 2 objectives tell us about what's likely to happen as far as the circular economy is concerned on the next slide. The definitions are fairly lengthy. They deal with every sector of the economy. There's something like a 200-page annex for both adaptation and mitigation. If we go on to the next slide, please, Fiona, start to talk about one of the sectors, and that's plastics. And here I've reproduced the text for what constitutes a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation in the sector of manufacturing plastics. And in the triangles in the middle, I've sort of extracted what are that are being pointed to here in the taxonomy. If you want to demonstrate a substantial contribution to climate change mitigation, you're either going to be looking at mechanical recycling of plastic, or if that's not technically feasible, then chemical recycling of plastics or the use of biofeedstocks. So any plastic manufacturing activity that doesn't meet one of those 3 criteria, the screening criteria, would not be classified as a sustainable activity and therefore not qualify. At the moment, only 9% of plastics are recycled. So that 8 million tons of plastic estimate there, that is a global one rather than a European one, but it gives a substantial area of opportunity to move into the mechanical recycling of plastics, again, subject to technical and economic viability. The less preferred routes here, chemical recycling and biofeedstocks, have to demonstrate that an improvement is being made in climate change mitigation using a specific standard. I'll come on to those in a second. So we're seeing criteria clearly set out, but also then thresholds against those criteria which enable an activity to be measured in terms of its sustainability. So if we go on to the next slide, please, Fiona. Okay, so this is the part of the technical screening criteria annex that deals with do no significant harm, and I should have underlined that at the top of the little bit of text in red, but I obviously forgot to do that. Here it's saying that if you meet those previous criteria for a significant contribution to the objective, then there are no applicable constraints as far as the transition to a circular economy is concerned. That is, if you can show significant benefit, then at the same time, the Commission believes the taxonomy ensures that you're doing no significant harm against the circular economy. And that means that these 2 objectives clearly are absolutely aligned. And that's useful to us here because it's telling us about what the taxonomy is going to say about the circular economy as far as the manufacture of plastics is concerned. So again, if we move on to the next slide, and then the next one, I'm going to start talking about measuring circularity, and then and therefore what are the metrics we need to use to show how we perform against the benchmarks that the screening criteria set out. So what I've done is extract here in the top text box the various references that were made to in the annex, talking about climate change adaptation, in order to meet the sustainability objectives for plastics manufacturing. You're likely to need to look at performance against methods that are set out in the Renewable Energy Directive, in the Commission's recommendation about the life cycle environmental performance of products and organisations, and that's its product environmental footprint and organisational environmental footprint initiatives, or alternatively to use as benchmarks the ISO standards 14067 and 14064, the bottom one, carbon footprint and organisational carbon footprint initiatives that it has there. So again, it's pointing you to very clear methods as to how to determine what is a significant, how to measure a significant contribution in terms of an activity, in this case for plastics manufacturing, but these are pretty much going to be the same for the other industry sectors as well. And I've used as a different example here because there's nothing in quantitative terms for plastics manufacturing other than you have to improve upon the baseline, the thresholds for aluminium manufacturing. So what it's saying here, if you're producing primary aluminium, the activity has to comply with two of the following criteria, 1, 2, and 3. Its greenhouse gas emissions for aluminium production have to be less than 1.4 tons, sorry, 1,400 tons of carbon dioxide per ton of aluminium. And that's quite a significant efficiency bar. So only about the top 10% of aluminium production would meet that threshold. The second criterion is that carbon intensity for the indirect greenhouse gas emissions associated with aluminium production are not above 100 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. The indirect greenhouse gas emissions are going to be associated with the electricity consumption in aluminium manufacture. And 100 grams of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour is quite low. So you wouldn't be able to use natural gas, for example. It would have to be a mix of renewables at best, and conceivably only renewable energy production. And then the last of the three criteria there are electricity consumption itself has to be less than 15.5 megawatt hours per ton of aluminium, and that's to make sure that you have you don't have an inefficient aluminium production plant being considered to be sustainable, even if it uses renewable energy, even if its overall greenhouse gas emissions per ton are low. It's making sure that it's still an efficient system, so it's not profligate with renewable resources. And then B at the bottom says that secondary aluminium per se counts as making a sustainable contribution to climate change mitigation. So investment in secondary aluminium production is de facto sustainable, or considered to be sustainable. Okay, so if you'd move on to the next slide, please, Fiona. So there are other means of measuring circularity that have been developed, perhaps not surprisingly. I mentioned the Ellen MacArthur Foundation earlier. It's got a Circulytics, what it called the Circulytics program. So an example of, or some examples of some graphics drawn from Circulytics, and something like 1,000 or more companies have already used this system to benchmark themselves against other companies, and to try and pick out which areas of the circular economy, which principles they're adopting most thoroughly, and where they have still some room to catch up. And on the right-hand side of the slide, I've also pointed to some other examples of circular economy graphics identified the European Commission. So there's no shortage of resources with which to measure the various dimensions of circularity. And the next slide, Fiona. From the WBCSD. It has its circular transition indicators framework, which again has provided tools that have been developed with its members and are now being applied more widely to show where there is opportunity for gains with greater circularity and to allow companies to benchmark themselves against one another. And I've also pointed here to the Alliance to End Plastic Waste, another WBCSD initiative, partly because I was talking about plastics earlier on, which is helping to demonstrate where various solutions bring about benefits for plastic circularity that then align with the requirements of the taxonomy that I was pointing to before. Next slide, please, Fiona. And the next one as well. So I'd already pointed to some of the estimates of the scale of opportunity there is associated with the circular economy. Again, $4.5 trillion is quite a lot. We'll gladly take any part of that. And albeit that this is text from the Commission trying to encourage people to become more circular, the idea that there are opportunities associated with improving sales, reducing costs, strengthening customer employee relationships, and mitigating linear risk, by which it means the leakage of materials and potential liabilities associated with that down the value chain, all are sort of valuable dimensions of circularity to try and get a grip on and to gain benefits from. But let's remind ourselves that in order to be classified as sustainable, we need to make a substantial contribution to one of the 6 objectives in the taxonomy, to do no significant harm to the other 5 objectives, and to comply with minimum social guidelines. I don't think I mentioned those before, but here we're talking about OECD guidelines on social impact, the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, and the International Bill on Human Rights, and mechanisms such as those. If we move on to the next slide, please, Fiona. Again, back to plastics, we've got a globally a large number of initiatives that are further pressing for action on single-use plastics in particular, but also plastics more generally, that again provides us some opportunity for demonstrating where the activities that the taxonomy is pointing us towards, use of secondary materials, chemical recycling, mechanical recycling, and biofeedstocks, gives us an opportunity for addressing some of these other mechanisms and helps create a market for that type of activity. Next slide, please, Fiona. So I'm coming back here to what I picked out of the taxonomy technical screening criteria earlier on, and summarized at the bottom of the slide some of the text in this 200-page document that says where one has to be vigilant in order to avoid no significant harm being done to the circular economy principle. As I said, for the plastics manufacturing sector, there was alignment between climate change mitigation and the circular economy objectives. So there was no potential trade-off being seen there. However, so for some of the other sectors, there potentially is a trade-off. And as I said, this text largely summarizes where there might be some tension. And that points us to in this case, sort of 5 broad categories that I've identified of the sorts of principles and opportunities that we should be looking for in the circular economy, particularly for plastics, but I think it's applicable elsewhere as well, that will help us in identifying circular opportunities that would be classified as sustainable under the taxonomy. And so those are the use of secondary materials that I mentioned before, designed for circularity. So that's trying to make sure that the product or the material itself is returned to the economy at end of life, and clearly avoiding the single-use plastics issue that I mentioned before. Application of the waste hierarchy, driving the management of a waste stream progressively up the hierarchy, from disposal at the bottom to recovery, to recycling, to reuse, and also to prevention. So the clear demonstration of movement up the hierarchy could also be classified as sustainable. Issues associated with substance traceability. And this is the concern that substances of concern associated with plastics or any other product would be trapped within the economy, circulated, and conceivably lead to hazards and risk. If those substances are traceable, it means that they can be more easily removed from the economy or separated from principal flows of materials, so that those can be the maximum value can be obtained from those flows, whilst the more hazardous materials can be managed in a way that's appropriate. And then the last of the points picked out in terms of do no significant harm is about land use change. And I'll come back to that as a risk a little bit later on. But there is a concern that whilst we might consider biomaterials and bioplastics to be an opportunity for demonstrating a substantial contribution to sustainability, and they are, there is also a risk associated with land use change connected with that. Next slide, please, Fiona. And from those principles, I've just sort of picked out some areas where we might look for opportunity, again associated with plastics. On the left-hand side, I've observed some statistics about what the value of the plastics lost to the environment is estimated to be. Again, a very figure indeed. How might we retain some of that value? Well, from the top, removing avoidable packaging, stopping the use of single-use packaging in particular, then creating a circular economy for plastics, so bringing them back into recycling and reuse. Thirdly, collaborating to create markets for those materials, innovating to reduce their life cycle impact. So that means creating, producing them more efficiently, potentially the use of biomaterials, certainly increasing recycled content. Around this circle, engaging consumers to help them reduce and recycling. So probably should say customers actually rather than consumers. Again, the idea of building circular models and making reduction of waste and recycling routine, and benefiting from the return of those materials to the economy. Next slide, Fiona. So I've sort of summarised opportunities here in a sort of a way I think applies across materials. It's not plastic specific, although it could certainly be applied to that, drawing from the annexes we have to the taxonomy at the moment that point out where we can make a significant contribution, but also where we need to be careful to avoid significant harm. So from sort of 1 o'clock round, we see opportunity associated with innovative product design, increases of quality of product quality over sort of fast fashion and so on, durability and lifetime, making products last longer and gaining from that. Secondly, in terms of biomaterials, recycled materials and low footprint production. So we're reducing the impact of the materials and the products that we use in the economy, just in terms of the type of material used. Thirdly, material, product and service leasing. So we improve recovery rates and avoid material leakage by leasing products and materials rather than selling them, keeping them within our control, perhaps partnering with others to ensure that these materials are kept close to us and we don't lose control over them. Back to packaging on the fourth, opportunities around recyclable, reusable, refillable and biodegradable packaging. So reducing the impact of the packaging itself and ensuring that it's made from materials that are kept in a circular loop wherever possible. Then opportunities associated with circular logistics and end-of-life processing. I haven't mentioned much about partnership, but clearly avoiding losing materials from the economy, recovering at end of life is something that's the domain of the waste management industry. They have the logistics to deliver solutions there, and I think there's considerable opportunity for improvement in that and to oil the wheels that will make the circular truck go round, as it were. And then lastly, value in circular brands, the brands themselves that are associated with circularity and avoiding these types of environmental impact, I think will prosper, and we can already see that to quite some considerable extent. Next slide, Fiona. So need to, and just click on as well, if you will, need to balance some of the opportunity, and click on again, please, with risks. And I briefly touched on this one before. Of course, we want to avoid single-use plastics and their effect on the environment, waste in the oceans, microplastics, and so on and so forth. However, if we are to replace those with biopolymers, to indirect land use change. There's only so much agricultural and forestry production in the world at the moment, and all of its materials are used. So if you want to consume some more biomass feedstock in order to make plastics, there's a danger that you'll create indirect land use change because of displacement. And the European Commission's been very clear about this because it's had its fingers burned in the past around the biofuels debate, where encouragement for biofuels in the belief that they were better than fossil fuels both conceivably led to land use change, and also in some cases was shown to be counterproductive. It's not carbon free to biofuels or biofeedstocks. Beyond that, biopolymers may be subject to the same problems as fossil plastics. You can make PET from biofeedstocks, and there's a lot of it about. Not perhaps given the total volume of PET, but there's a decent proportion of bio-PET now being produced. However, it's still PET. It still makes exactly the same plastic bottle with the same risks associated with it at end of life as if it was a virgin PET bottle. So one needs to be aware not to be sort of drawn into that trap. These sorts of counterproductive outcomes would almost certainly be classified as significant harm. So one might be moving into biomaterials only to find that they weren't classified as sustainable under the taxonomy. If we move on, Fiona, I've just got a couple more slides, I think. The way perhaps to combat these risks, and it's identified in the types of benchmark and metric that I referred to on an earlier slide, is to have a due diligence approach that looks at the whole of the value chain and avoids that type of burden shifting. And I referred to some of the methods in the Renewable Energy Directive and the Productive Environmental Footprint and Organisational Environmental Footprint initiatives earlier on. And that should provide us with assurances if we carry out investigations that we're not going to be subject to this type of burden shifting that means we wouldn't be classified as sustainable. And then the last slide, I think, Fiona. after that one. So in summary, what I tried to do here was pull out sort of 6 key areas that I thought offered opportunity, and a couple of points against each of those. So first of all, reducing leakage, moving from those linear systems to circular ones, and not only for plastics, and that's all about minimizing waste, capturing waste, and maximizing energy efficiency, but at the same time being aware that reusable systems do still involve some other consumptions for reverse logistics, for example, and you need to make sure that those don't counterbalance the benefit of waste capture. As we've found out in the past, it doesn't make sense to fly glass bottles back from the Outer Hebrides in Scotland in order for them to be recycled in the central belt of Scotland, because you consume far much more or release more greenhouse gas emissions from aviation fuel than you do save in recycling the glass. Secondly, recovering resources, and that could be mechanical or chemical recycling that I referred to before, potentially also energy recovery, although that's likely to be omitted from the taxonomy as a sustainable. And co-location, taking advantage of industrial ecology and symbiosis, allow businesses to work together to use one another's resources. Extending lifetimes, I believe there'll be a flight to quality. We will see less fast fashion and more bespoke and sustainable long-term apparel purchased. Reusability, particularly around packaging, we're seeing that already. Design for durability and repair, disassembly and circularity, making things simply that last longer, and that they'll cost more, and they may cost to maintain, but they will reduce environmental impacts and perhaps be treasured as a result. Talked about bioresources already, but it's not just in plastics. We see applications there. Of course, paperboard, biochemicals, textiles, and construction all give us opportunities for using bioresources better and replacing more scarce mineral resources, provided we avoid land use change. And then new business models may be ways of implementing some of these opportunities, and I just mentioned leasing, sharing, but also facilitating in order to, as I said before, make the wheels go round, all as opportunities to take advantage of the circular economy. Next slide, Fiona. I think that's it from me. Apologies for the mix-up at the start of the presentation. I'm not sure what quite went wrong there, but Fiona, thanks very much for navigating through the slides. That was much appreciated. Happy to take any questions now if we've still got time before going back into the networking sessions.
Yes, Simon, thanks a lot for hosting this call. Let me check the Q&A for a second. I don't see any questions coming in. So I think the story was really clear to everybody.
Let's hope we didn't lose people as we went through, Eddie.
No, and actually there are still the same number of attendees. And there's one question coming in now, so maybe people waited until the end to the end to post the questions. Why would leasing be a circular economy opportunity?
Okay, so obviously it does depend on what type of product you might be leasing, but the aim is to get more from less. It's a more efficient system that I mentioned before, and particularly around leakage. If you lease a material, and there are people thinking about leasing their plastics out, for example, you make sure that you get it back at the end of life because you haven't relinquished ownership. If you sell it and you still want to get it back at the end of life, you haven't got control. It may have value and you may be able to buy it back, or it may be returned by other actors in the economy, but you don't have the same guarantee that you do if you're leasing plastic or indeed any material.
Cool. Yeah. Hopefully the answer was clear enough, and maybe people could let us know via the chat whether that was the case. Some other questions are coming in. How do you think the technical screening criteria for the circular economy might be defined? So the technical screening criteria, the definition.
Okay, so I think we see some of that reflected in the opportunities for climate change adaptation that I mentioned, because we see that there was no significant harm associated with those areas where a significant contribution was going to be made for climate change adaptation. The direction towards, recycling, more innovative recovery routes like chemical recycling, and the direction towards biofeedstocks, again, I think are going to be the key themes that we see in the circular economy screening criteria. And I know that's a bit plastics related, but again, it'll be the same for other sectors. More effective waste minimization, driving waste up the hierarchy, avoiding it being lost. It'll be issues like that we see given us opportunities to meet the criteria for the circular economy, I think, across sectors.
All right, thanks a lot. And I think a last question for now coming in. Are consumer behavior and logistics to be considered major challenge to make circular economy a success story?
Well, at the moment they certainly are, yes, and I mean, this is the big issue about single-use plastics. I don't want to just talk about, but single-use plastics are a problem not because there aren't very valuable attributes of plastics. They're a problem because what happens at end of life with them, and nobody wants plastics to be dumped into the ocean, but they are, because either consumers don't see the value of managing them properly, or because there aren't appropriate waste management arrangements for those products. And whilst the problem is more of developing countries than it is for Europe, we still know that plastics leak into the environment at end of life here as well. On the go packaging for food and drink, for example, leads to a litter problem pretty much across the European Union. So that's a consumer issue, but either the infrastructure isn't there for these materials to be managed properly, or consumers conceivably aren't educated, trained in the right degree, and that obviously varies considerably across the European Union, or these are just not appropriate systems, and we need to design better ways of delivering the packaging function, or whatever the function might be, to society.
All right, that was the last question. Thanks for clear presentation and the answers to the question. I'm sure Simon and Oyol will stick around a bit in the on the tables just now when we leave this little stage. Everybody feel welcome to do some networking behind this after this call. There will be tables where you can be seated and chat with your fellow participants of this webinar. With that, again, thanks a lot for hosting this webinar, and I'll catch you on the flip side at one of the tables. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Eddie. Cheers.